Today, when we think about the defining moments of the Second World War, one stands out above all others: D-Day. And within that vast operation, no landing has come to symbolise it more than Omaha Beach. Not because of what went right, but because of how close it came to going wrong. On the morning of the 6th of June 1944, along this stretch of coastline, a plan months in the making began to unravel within minutes. Units were scattered, support failed, and entire companies were cut down before they even reached the shore. And yet, by the end of the day, the beach had been taken. To understand how that happened, we need to look beyond a single story. Because Omaha was not won in one place or by one decisive moment, but in fragments across the length of the beach as small groups of men forced their way forward under vastly different conditions. In this video, using mapping, veteran accounts and previously unseen resources, we break Omaha Beach down sector by sector, reconstructing how the separate breakthroughs combined to unlock what was, for a time, the most dangerous battlefield in Europe. This is the story of Omaha Beach. But understanding Omaha is a complex task. Our very first stop to do that has to be right here, in Omaha's western sector, best known as the inspiration for the film Saving Private Ryan. But to get there, we first need to understand Omaha Beach as a whole, which was by far the trickiest of all 5 D-Day landing beaches to assault. The primary reason for Omaha's difficulty were these hills or bluffs lining most of the frontage of the 4-mile-long beach and offering the Germans ample means to rain fire down onto the attackers. Although not as heavily fortified as the area around Calais, the German defences in the area were still formidable. Pillboxes, machine gun nests, beach obstacles, barbed wire and mines all lined the shore and inland paths. Taking the bluffs and neutralising the German defences would not be an easy task, but there was a means of doing so. Along Omaha, 4 natural gullies, features known as draws, offered breaks in the bluff and quick access to move men and vehicles off the beach. For our story, we'll be focusing right here on the D1 draw, near the village of Vierville-sur-Mer. With its wide road and good inland access, it was considered the most important objective of the entire landing, and therefore posed the greatest challenge. Let's have a closer look. The Vierville draw was guarded by 3 major groups of German defences known as Widerstandsnests or WNs, each with its own series of fortifications and trenches. WN 71 was positioned here to the east side of the draw and contained several bunkers for machine guns and multiple mortar pits that could fire not only onto the beach but also along the road leading towards Vierville itself. Nestled amongst these houses was WN 72, the most formidable of the 3. A bunker, built out of the shell of an old hotel, housed an 88mm Pak 43 and was guarded by 2 9-foot tall, 6-foot wide reinforced concrete walls that stretched across the road, blocking vehicles from moving inland. Just to the west, another bunker contained a 50mm gun mounted on a swivel which could fire both to the east and west. Roughly 200 yards up the coast was WN 73, with a further 75mm anti-tank gun located just here, along with several mortar pits and machine guns. All were sited to fire enfilade along the beach. This gave them more protection from naval fire and gave the attackers less place to hide. Trenches and additional machine gun nests were scattered throughout the entire area. Mines dotted the sloping cliffs, barbed wire ran along the seawall, and various anti-tank obstacles and mines were scattered between the seawall and 300 yards of flat sandy beach up to the low water mark. In short, the Vierville defences would be a very tough nut to crack. The task of securing this stretch of Omaha fell to the men of the unblooded 29th Infantry Division. Specifically, the 1st Battalion of the 116th Infantry Regiment was assigned to the Vierville draw. Companies of between 120 to 150 men each would hit the beach in multiple waves, advancing across this very ground in full view of the enemy before clearing the closest defences, pushing inland up the Vierville draw and establishing a foothold for supporting troops to come ashore. Company A would be in the first wave, landing on this sector designated Dog Green at around 6:30 am. To their left, Company G of the 2nd Battalion would land in support here on Dog White, while Company C of the 2nd Ranger Battalion, consisting of 65 men, would land just here in Charlie sector. At 7 am, the second wave would land with Companies B, C and D, reinforcing Dog Green along with 5th Rangers. Companies A and B of the 2nd Rangers would land between Dog Green and Dog White. Armour would be sent in with the first wave. including the new amphibious DD tanks, as well as engineers to clear the beach obstacles. The beach and the draw itself were to be secure by 9 AM. Those initial plans were ultimately approved, but not everyone was satisfied with them. One man in particular was Brigadier General Norman Cota. Born in Chelsea, Massachusetts on the 30th of May 1893, Dutch Cota had graduated West Point in the summer of 1917 and had steadily risen through the ranks to become Chief of Staff of the 1st Infantry Division by June 1942. During Operations Torch and Husky, Cota developed a reputation as an expert in amphibious assaults, favouring tactical surprise and pre-dawn landings to minimise casualties. While Cota was not alone in his thinking, he was overruled as the landings would be preceded by naval bombardment and aerial bombing to soften up the German defences. On the afternoon of the 5th of June, Cota, now Assistant Commander of the 29th Division, addressed his staff. "You're going to find confusion. The landing craft aren't going to be in on schedule and people are going to be landed in the wrong place. Some won't be landed at all. We must improvise, carry on, not lose our heads." On the evening of the 5th of June 1944, a massive armada of over 6,000 ships set sail across the English Channel to commence Operation Neptune, the code name for the naval portion of the invasion. Battleships USS Texas and Arkansas, along with 3 cruisers and over a dozen destroyers, were assigned to Omaha. Over 450 B-24 Liberators would conduct bombing raids ahead of the main landings. General Omar Bradley promised the men that the bombardment would make short work of the German positions and referred to it as the greatest show on earth. Despite his confidence, most of those en route were in little doubt of what was to come. Amongst them were 31 men in Company A, 116th, all hailing from the small town of Bedford, Virginia, who were promptly dubbed the Bedford Boys. 2 of them, 24-year-old twin brothers Ray and Roy Stevens, went to board separate transports. As Ray offered to shake his brother's hand, Roy declined, telling him he'd do so on the beach. Right here, off the coast of Omaha at approximately 5:50 AM, the opening salvos began. Although both the Texas and Arkansas fired over 700 rounds each, the naval guns proved ineffective against the majority of the beach defences. To make matters worse, overcast skies coupled with smoke and dust from the naval fire caused the supporting bombers to hold their payloads longer to avoid hitting their own men, who by now were making their way to shore. When those bombs were dropped, most fell well behind the German positions. On this, Lieutenant Colonel Herbert Hicks Jr. would later report, "The Air Corps might as well have stayed home in bed for all the good their bombing concentration did." For those soaking and seasick men in the leading landing craft, the terrifying reality had set in. Now, instead of facing a stunned and significantly reduced enemy force, the first wave would have to deal with the full might of an alert and prepared German defence. The plan continued to go awry as the leading waves approached the beach. Smoke from grass fires caused by the bombardment, as well as strong currents in the choppy seas, made it difficult for the landing craft to reach their designated zones. When within several hundred yards of the coast, enemy fire erupted from the smoke-shrouded bluffs to their front. It was clear to all that it would be an extremely tough fight. While Company A and the Rangers were able to mostly reach their intended locations, Company G drifted too far to the east, landing closer to Dog Red sector. The result being that Company A found itself practically alone in front of formidable German defences around the D1 draw. Of the 6 landing craft that brought Company A to shore, 1 foundered at sea, 1 was knocked out by artillery, and the remainder grounded not on the beach, but on a sandbar roughly 50 yards from shore. The design of the LCAs, or landing craft assault, not the Higgins boat as seen further along the beach, meant that the men could only exit single file. As men began to disembark, German machine guns and artillery hammered into them. Many were cut down before they even left the craft. Those that could now had to wade through water neck deep in some parts just to make it ashore. Some, so heavily laden with equipment, were dragged under and never resurfaced. All the while, the fire from the cliffs poured into the men below, cutting them to shreds. Men struggled ashore, some pushing the wounded through the water to try and save them. The few who did make it to the sand sought shelter where they could. The losses of Company A were staggering, especially to officers and NCOs. Within just 15 minutes of landing, the unit had practically ceased to exist. The armour had fared a little better. Most of the amphibious DD tanks, launched too far out in rough seas, would be swamped within moments and still today lie at the bottom of the English Channel. Other tanks were ferried closer in and immediately came under fire from the German AT guns, with 14 being knocked out in quick succession. Some men attempted to use the tanks as cover, but they had little room to maneuver while rolling over the corpses of the infantry to stay alive. Many became trapped behind obstacles in the surf. The engineers who had landed were given 27 minutes to clear 16 passages for the tanks to move through, but exposed and unprotected, they became easy prey for the marksmen and machine guns, and their work was further hindered by the men desperately sheltering behind the obstacles they had to destroy. Only one passage was cleared, and around half of the engineers at Dog Green became casualties. As the dead continued to pile up, the situation was dire. About 30 minutes after the initial landings, the second wave began their approach. As with the first, the rough seas and obstructive views caused several craft to miss their intended sectors. Company C landed on Dog White by mistake and found themselves isolated. Companies B and D were scattered from Dog Green to Red. Those that managed to join what remained of A Company quickly became bogged down with them. Some men of B Company managed to join the Rangers who landed on Charlie. Together they began to scale this cliff to launch an assault on WN-73 and take the pressure off Dog Green. Colonel Max Schneider of the 5th Rangers shifted his forces to Dog White when he saw how untenable Dog Green was. The smoke that had created havoc earlier on now managed to obscure the Rangers from German fire, and they joined Company C almost in their entirety. Just behind the Rangers, at around 7:30 am, came none other than General Cota himself, whose appearance would be a turning point. Cota almost didn't get the chance, however, for on his way in, his craft struck a mine-laden obstacle, though lucky for him, the mine rolled off into the sea without detonating. His craft stopped roughly 50 yards offshore just here, meaning Cota and his staff, affectionately called the Bastard Brigade, had to move through knee-deep water the rest of the way to the tenuous protection found just here at the seawall. As he disembarked, 3 men in his craft were killed instantly from gunfire. Cota made his way ashore to assess the situation. To him, it was clear that everything that could go wrong had gone wrong. Men were still hunkering down by the seawall, refusing to move. Cota knew that action was needed now, otherwise the men would simply stay put and die. In an extraordinary display of bravery, he began calmly walking up and down the beach, oblivious to the gunfire around him, attempting to rally his troops. "Gentlemen," he said, "we're being killed on the beaches. Let us go inland and be killed." His confidence was exactly what the men needed. Sergeant Francis Hooser later exclaimed, "I guess all of us figured out that if he could go wandering around like that, we could too." Cota soon found Colonel Schneider and asked him what unit he was in. When Schneider replied, "Rangers," Cota famously remarked, "Well, if you're Rangers, then get up there and lead the way." The phrase stuck. "Rangers lead the way" has been their official motto ever since. Let's zoom out to assess the current situation. Across much of the length of Omaha Beach, battered infantry were pinned under the unrelenting barrage of German mortar, artillery and small arms fire, with men huddled beneath shallow seawalls or hiding behind beach obstacles as the incoming tide swamped their comrades too badly injured to move. Tanks that hadn't been destroyed or abandoned had retreated to the surf to have more room to dodge anti-tank shells. Around Vierville, the attack by the Rangers and WN-73 was now though in progress, but it was slow going as men scaled this break in the cliffs. From a vantage point, a German officer could see at least 10 burning tanks and the men crowding the seawall. To the Germans, it appeared that the American attack had stalled and was about to be hurled back into the sea. Nevertheless, reinforcements had been requested, but due to the situation in the rest of Normandy, none would arrive. If a breakout was to occur, it had to be now. While the Vierville draw seemed the most obvious route off the beach, it was not the only one. As we can see, this small draw, running obliquely up the bluffs, could allow the men to ascend the cliffs and flank the German defences, offering a chink in the armour of the Atlantic Wall. It will be here that the American breakout would commence. Company C of the 116th would be the ones to lead the push off the beach. At long last, one man managed to blast a hole in the barbed wire covering the top of the seawall with a Bangalore torpedo. The first man through the breach was cut down by German fire. Cota, with pistol in hand, jumped through next, and the rest of the men followed. A mortar landed nearby, killing 2 men and throwing the general to the ground, but he was soon back on his feet to continue the advance. The leading men made their way across this road which runs parallel to the beach to the base of the bluffs. Using a communications trench to avoid the multitude of mines, they proceeded in single file before reaching the draw. After taking a few moments to recover, the men soon reached the top, coming under machine gun fire from WN-70 guarding the area. Cota led the charge himself, forcing the enemy back, and in doing so, opened a route off the beach. As Cota made his climb, Schneider's 5th Rangers made their own breaches and scaled the draws here, 100 yards to Cota's right. Additionally, companies A and B of the 2nd Rangers, who had landed between Dog Green and White, had fought their own way up, losing half their number in the process. The combined forces quickly captured WN-70, which had already been heavily damaged by naval fire. The tide was now turning in the Americans' favour. This vital location acted like a magnet for all troops in the vicinity as stragglers from various units flooded the breach. By 9 AM, around 600 Americans were on the cliffs east of the Vierville draw. Spotting the church steeple in the distance, they headed in this direction towards the village, which held the key to unlocking the Vierville draw. Cota himself had pushed so far ahead of his men, some of whom later recalled finding him near the northeastern road twirling his pistol waiting for them. "Where the hell have you boys been?" he asked. As he led the 116th down this road, the Rangers pushed south to clear the enemy outside the village. As they entered the hedgerows around here, they were stopped by a series of machine gun nests holding a line of resistance. Unable to find a way through without heavy weapons, the Rangers pulled back and established holding positions in case of a German counterattack. Cota, though, along this road, advanced into Vierville itself around noon, taking this exact route, encountering little resistance along the way. At the same time, naval fire from the USS Texas and 3 destroyers were targeting the remaining Vierville defences, with direction from spotters on the beach, silencing many of the remaining German guns. By this point, the Rangers from Charlie and their Company B companions had finally captured WN-73 and had been slowly eradicating Germans from the cliffs west of the draw. The majority of the 116th began pushing west themselves, while Cota took 5 men towards the draw. Moving along this very road, they came under fire from this bunker dug into the cliffs protecting the draw. The Americans returned fire, taking out 5 of their attackers, and the remaining Germans quickly surrendered. By early afternoon, the last vestiges of resistance around the draw had dissipated as the defenders, outflanked and outnumbered, saw that the situation was lost and withdrew as best they could, leaving behind thousands of spent cartridge cases around smoking machine guns which for hours had wrought havoc on the men trapped on the beach below. All that remained now was the concrete wall blocking the road. Cota and his men followed POWs through a minefield at the base of the wall and headed back to the beach. With the use of Bangalore's, TNT and a bulldozer, the final obstacle of the Vierville draw came down in a rain of smoke and concrete, bringing an end to the day's carnage. By 4 PM, 9 hours after originally intended, the Vierville draw on Omaha Beach was officially secure.
But Vierville was only one part of a much larger fight. In fact, up and down the length of Omaha, men had been battling all day to work their way ashore under intense enemy fire, and in some cases with remarkable success. Right at the heart of the fight, and amongst the first to scale those bluffs, were the men of the neighbouring 1st Infantry Division, who breached Fortress Europe through an area we today know as Spalding's Draw. This is their story. The key characters of concern to us, conveniently, all came ashore in the first wave on the same landing craft. They were men of E Company of the 16th Infantry Regiment of the 1st Infantry Division. Let's meet a few. Leading that group was 2nd Lieutenant John Martin Spalding. Born in 1914 in the state of Indiana to a working-class family, he enlisted in February 1941 at Louisville, Kentucky, as a private soldier, later being commissioned as a 2nd lieutenant, which is exactly where he found himself on the eve of D-Day. Yet to see combat, he was nevertheless keen to do his bit. Alongside him, and acting as his deputy section leader, was Technical Sergeant Philip Phil Streisig. A New Jersey native of Polish heritage, he was vastly experienced and had already seen service in Tunisia and Sicily, where he'd earned no less than 3 Silver Stars for gallantry and a reputation as a courageous and resourceful soldier.
Also in the section were these men, including Sergeants Colwell, Colson and Biscoe, along with 20-year-old Brooklyn native Vincent Vinny Digitano, who had the ominous duty of carrying the section's flamethrower.
And so it was, these 32 men, along with the remainder of E Company's 16th Infantry Regiment, who were given the job of prizing open the defences of Hitler's Atlantic Wall on this part of Easy Red. Their job, quite simply, was to land in this area, advance up the E1 draw into Saint-Laurent-sur-Mer, neutralising the enemy defences along the way, including right here at WN 64. In doing so, they would unlock one half of the E1 draw, allowing the follow-on waves to push up the Lerouque Valley and outflank the remaining defences on Omaha. At least that was the idea. This aerial image offers a harrowing glimpse into that one famous moment in history, but also allows us to explore the area as it looked at the time. In the Easy Red sector, we can clearly identify the location of German defences, including WN 64, which was in fact still under construction on D-Day. Perhaps most important is this area, the remains of a knocked-down house known on Allied maps as the Roman Ruins. This was a key orientation point on Easy Red, and its actual location can still be identified today by this concrete block, which was present in 1944 and shows us exactly where the ruins, long since gone, were once located. This will be the area in which Spalding's, and so our story, will unfold. To tell that story, we have the benefit of Spalding's own words and recollections from that momentous day. By 6:30 AM on the 6th of June, his craft, filled with terrified, spray-soaked and almost entirely seasick men, found itself heading for the shore as part of the first wave on Omaha Beach.
When we got 200 yards offshore, the boat halted, and a member of the Navy crew yelled for us to drop the ramp. Sergeant Fred Biscoe and I kicked the ramp down. Shortly before this, a Navy man had mounted the machine gun on the rear of the LCVP and started to return fire. We were now receiving not only machine gun, but also mortar and artillery fire. We'd come in at low tide, and the obstacles were noticeable. As we left the boat, we spread out in a V formation, about 30 yards across. There was soon a noticeable decline of sand beneath our feet, and we were soon over our heads, so we tried to swim. Sergeant Strezick and the medic, Private George Bowen, were carrying an 18-foot ladder which was to be used for crossing the anti-tank ditch or for any purpose which might arise. They were struggling with it in the water, just about time that I was having my worst trouble afloat. As the ladder came by me, I grabbed it. Strezick yelled and said, "Lieutenant, we don't need any help." But hell, I was busy trying to get help, not to give it.
What Spalding and his men had very quickly found was that rather than landing directly on the beach, they had in fact hit a sandbar and had to cross several deep pools, almost fatally, before even reaching the shore. Now cold, thoroughly waterlogged, and still hundreds of yards from the dubious safety at the base of the bluffs in this area, they had to make their way as best they could towards their objective. Their saving grace was in many ways a tragic one. The fire they took was less than they might have expected, for several reasons. First, they had landed in front of a relative weak spot between WN 62 and WN 64 in a lightly defended part of the beach. Sadly, the other reason was that the rest of E Company and most of the 16th had not. Drifting to their left on their run-in, they had landed directly into the mouth of WN 62, one of the most formidable defensive positions on Omaha. The result was the gunners in that position had plenty of easier targets much closer by, and the destruction they wrought in just a few minutes on the rest of E Company and the 16th was horrific. For Spalding and his men, the advance across the beach was still no easy task. In navigating the beach obstacles, they had to avoid mines, mortar and plenty of small arms fire, pressing on as fast as their heavy equipment and waterlogged clothes would allow. It was during this time Privates Roper and Tilley were both hit, but thankfully no one killed. That changed just a few moments later, when reaching this area around the Roman ruins, Sergeant Raimundo, seeing the beleaguered E Company men under WN 62 several hundred yards to his left, began moving in that direction, only to be hit and killed by a sniper from the bluffs above. It was here, sheltering below the bluffs of Omaha Beach, that finally Spalding's men were able to return fire, targeting lone riflemen and several concealed machine gun positions to their left. For For those less fortunate, like PFC Digitano, he was told to head back onto the beach to retrieve the flamethrower pack that had done its best to drown him on the way to shore. It was now that Spalding, with the vastly experienced Streisig, took stock. Clearly they were alone, though in something of a dead spot and with a small natural gully to their front, and it seemed that they were faring better than their comrades further down the beach. So there was only one choice: push on, scale the bluffs and silence those guns. In order to do that, first a section of barbed wire to their front had to be breached with the Bangalore torpedo, which was accomplished by Staff Sergeant Colwell, eventually opening up a path right here to climb the bluffs. With Streisig in the lead and using all his experience to avoid the hundreds of mines sown into the slopes, they began to advance along this track, possibly passing a fortunately silent German machine gun position, all the while using the many dips and depressions for cover from small arms fire as they did so. It was by now about 7:30. Advancing painfully slowly against ever heavier small arms fire and with the constant risk of tripping mines beneath their feet, the men of E Company, as always led by Streisig, advanced yard by yard up the bluffs. Over the next hour, that advance continued with the commands strung out and the leading elements probing the enemy line, occasionally engaging small groups of enemy soldiers in a truly nerve-wracking experience. For the E Company men, there was one particular position, manned by a lone machine gunner just short of the crest to their front, which was proving decidedly problematic. Here's Spalding again.
I couldn't take my eye off the machine gun above us, so Sergeant Biscoe kept saying, "Lieutenant, watch out for the damn mines." They were little box-type mine, and it seems that the place was infested with them. The Lord was with us, and we had an angel on each shoulder on that trip. Trying to get the machine above us, Sergeant Blades fired his bazooka and missed. He was shot in the left arm almost immediately. Private First Class Curley was shot down next. Sergeant Phelps moved into position to fire and was shot in both legs. By this time, practically all my section had moved up. We decided to rush the machine gun about 15 yards away. As we rushed it, the lone German operating the gun threw up his hands and yelled, "Kamerad!" We would have killed him, but we needed prisoners for interrogation, so I ordered the men not to shoot him. He was Polish.
Records tell us that the Polish-speaking Sergeant Streisig, after sharing some choice words with the Polish prisoner who had so stubbornly manned his gun and was lucky to survive the encounter, continued to advance towards the top of the bluffs, whilst the wounded were left behind in the care of Private Bowen, the section medic. For the rest, the advance continued, this time with Sergeant Clarence Colson in the lead, firing the wounded Private Tilley's BAR from the hip as he did so. He was amongst the very first men to reach the summit of the bluffs a few minutes later to find a well-made trench running along the crest with a pillbox firing down on the rest of the section at its far end. Colson himself recalled what happened next.
This pillbox was the one that was holding the company up. Now I could use a trench to come right down the back end. Maybe they heard me shoot the guy in the trench, but they couldn't see me. The pillbox had a door that goes downstairs, and you have your gunner slot, see? So I got the BAR. It had a bipod on it, and I got it set up right. Opened the door and started spraying. All of a sudden, the white flag came out, and I quit firing. A bunch of Germans came out. I motioned for them to come on up. I don't know how many more was dead in there, but it was a good thing to stop these guys. Without that pillbox, the beach just got a whole lot safer.
Finally, after a grueling and exhausting assault through the horrors of Omaha Beach, there was a glimmer of hope. Despite the carnage unfolding on either side of them, some men had breached the enemy line, were on top of the bluffs, and finally there was a route inland. Exact records are unclear, but it's likely that shortly after Clarence Colson silenced that machine gun, men of G Company, 16th Infantry Regiment under Captain Joe Dawson, who had landed 20 minutes behind Spalding's group and also made the ascent, made contact. In a hurried discussion, it was decided that Dawson's group would turn left to assault towards Colville-sur-Mer, while Spalding's would turn right and continue to attack towards WN64. Over the next few hours, they would do exactly that. For both groups, there was still plenty more fighting to come as they advanced from hedgerow to hedgerow with rifles and grenades, and more men would pay the ultimate price. But the seemingly impossible had been achieved, and Omaha Beach was open. For the 32 men of Lieutenant Spalding's section, perhaps the very first to scale the bluffs, there had been mixed fortunes. Only 2 men, Sergeants Raimundo and Bisco, would pay with their lives. A further 8 more would be wounded. And 7 men, including Spalding, Streisig, Coulson and the medic Bowen, would earn the Distinguished Service Cross. Others still got a marble one. Several of the section to survive that day would not survive the war, falling in the many bitter battles to come. 2 men that did live, only to meet with tragedy, were Spalding and Streisig. The lieutenant, who had suffered severe battle fatigue later in the war, eventually went home to Kentucky, became a state legislator, remarried and had 3 more children, living a seemingly ideal life. But this powerful newspaper article, which appeared in the Owensboro Inquirer on the 6th of November 1959, tells of a tragic end to the life of a man who had achieved so much. Technical Sergeant Streisig, that legendary soldier within the 1st Infantry Division, would eventually go home to New Jersey, marry and have 4 children. But the horrors he witnessed in more than 440 days of combat from North Africa to the Hurtgen Forest would never leave him. Racked with PTSD and suffering physical pain from wartime wounds, Philip Streisig took his own life in June 1958 and became perhaps the last of so many casualties suffered on that bloody day on Omaha Beach.
At the eastern end of Omaha, in an area often overlooked in the story of the landings, men were also fighting for their lives, but uniquely on film, because arriving amongst those on Omaha's eastern end that day was Richard Taylor, a combat cameraman who shot the only actual combat footage from the beach. His story, and that of the men he caught on camera, is our focus for the final part of our look at the story of that day. But that famous film raises some fascinating questions. Where exactly was Taylor standing? What was happening around him at that moment? And how did the men in that footage manage to fight their way off D-Day's deadliest beach? You might have noticed that the American designations for those draws goes from west to east, D1, D3, E1 and E3. But what about D2 and E2? What's often not mentioned is that in addition to the main exits, there were smaller ones that were mere footpaths up the escarpment. These are difficult to identify since documentation on them is scarce. For example, it's possible this path, known today as Cota's Draw, was designated D2 at some point in the planning stages, and that this one, assaulted by a group under Lieutenant John Spalding, was at some point designated E2. Our focus for this video though will lie right here on the eastern end of the beach, with exit F1. Unlike the large draws that led to the main villages that were guarded by 2 or 3 resistance nests, F1 was just a fisherman's path that led to some farm fields and a small hamlet called Cabot on the outskirts of Colville-sur-Mer. The German nest just above F1 was WN60, which was not explicitly sited to guard the draw, but rather to provide enfilade artillery and mortar fire along the beach. Let's take a look. The best way to actually identify the various components of WN60 is through this fascinating aerial shot taken on D-Day itself. It clearly shows a network of trenches and defensive positions arranged in this crescent shape atop the bluffs, though in truth it's difficult to unpick. But by superimposing this map and zooming in, we can explore the position in detail. Manned in June 1944 by 40 or so men of Company 3 of Grenadier Regiment 726, the nest was normally commanded by Oberfeldwebel Ludwig Pye. However, on June the 5th, Pye had been sent to WN62, and 29-year-old Gefreiter Alfred Eberhard was given the job as acting duty officer. The main armament of the position came in the form of 2 Belgian 75mm FK235 field guns, sighted westwards in dugout positions. The detail here is fascinating, as clearly the crew have painted on silhouette side and front profiles of Allied tanks onto their gun shield as a quick reference aid. Behind the 2 guns were these 2 concrete mortar Tobruks, also painted with sighting references. Each housed a 5cm French-built Festungsgranatwerfer 210, re-employed from the long-captured Maginot Line. Another concrete position just here was a Panzerturm, a concrete Tobruk, topped with a French APXR tank turret. There was also a fire control bunker manned by artillery observers built into the crest to direct inland batteries to bring more carnage onto the beach.
Various standard fighting points made up the rest of the nest, including at least 2 machine gun positions guarding the rear and improvised pillboxes along the eastern crest. Let's return to that aerial photo, which provides useful additional information. In particular, it shows that a path dug by the Germans to move building materials up to WN60 existed in this location, running from about this point on the beach. Also, though hard to make out, is this small track believed to be the Fisherman's Path, which formed exit F1. Running from the same area of the beach, it rose steadily for 515 yards until reaching the main road leading to the hamlet of Cabourg on the outskirts of Colville. Further protecting WN60 from seaward assault was the terrain. All along the beach at this point were 3 to 4 metre tall rock cliffs, which meant that any assault from here would have to be funneled through this narrow break in full view of the guns of WN60 and 61, some 500 yards to the west. The strengths of WN60, and especially the cliffs in front of it, are probably why F1 and this part of Omaha Beach were never actually designed to be directly assaulted on D-Day. But, as the old adage goes, no plan survives first contact with the enemy. Talking of plans, the Americans in this area had a fairly simple one. They had divided Omaha into sectors and split the responsibility for their capture across their 2 assaulting divisions, with the western end, Charlie and Dog sectors, the best known today, to be assaulted by the US 29th Division, and the eastern half, including Easy Red and our focus, Fox Green and Red, seen here on a pre-battle aerial shot with WN60, 61 and 62 included for reference, to be stormed by the battle-tested US 1st Infantry Division, the Big Red 1. Leading their assaulting waves were men of the 3rd Battalion, 16th Infantry Regiment, and more specifically for us, members of Company L. Let's meet a few. Captain John Armelino, a 23-year-old New Jersey native. He had graduated from New York Military Academy shortly before the outbreak of war and had since seen action in Algeria, Morocco, Tunisia and Sicily. On D-Day, he commanded the men of Company L. And Lieutenant Jimmy Monteith, 3 years Armelino's senior, Jimmy hailed from Virginia and had grown up in the city of Richmond. Drafted in October 1941, his leadership qualities were noted early and he was selected for officer training, ultimately joining the 16th as a second lieutenant in Algeria in April 1943. By June the following year, he was one of Company L's assault section leaders. Joining them on the beach, though likely in the 3rd wave, was this man, Sergeant Richard Taylor. Born in Iowa to British parents, Taylor was a member of the US Signal Corps' 165th Signal Photographic Company, tasked with capturing both film and photographs in the coming assault. The actual objective, though, for Armelino and his 187 men of Company L landing in 6 LCAs, not the often mistaken Higgins boat, was right here, WN61, the strong point guarding the eastern half of the large E3 or Colville draw, complete with a powerful westward-facing PAC-88 anti-tank gun. Aiming to touch down on a low but rising tide about 200 yards from the shingle line just here, his men would work their way ashore, scale the bluffs, silence WN61 and, if all went to plan, push inland to secure a foothold in Fortress Europe. At least that was the idea. So, early on the 6th of June 1944, tens of thousands of men watched on as an immense naval bombardment accompanied by B-25 bombers roared overhead to soften up the German defences. The awed observers didn't know it, but much of that massive ordnance expenditure came to nothing, as the dug-in German positions stood up well to the intense naval fire and many aircraft targeting the WNs delayed their bomb release and missed their targets. This aerial image shows the bomb craters from that mission and shows WN60, which, when measured with modern tools, revealed that the closest impact was some 530 yards from its intended target. Making matters worse, the massive amounts of smoke and dust kicked up by the bombardment largely obscured the coastline, meaning that approaching landing craft had few identifying markers with which to maintain direction. The result for the 6 LCAs of Company L and hundreds of other men of the leading wave on Omaha was chaos. Delay and confusion immediately descended, and Armelino's men were no exception. On the run into shore, No. 4 Section's LCA capsized in the harsh swell, with 8 of the 31 occupants drowning before even reaching the beach. And by the time the 5 remaining boats of Company L did touch down, it was already 7 AM, 30 minutes behind schedule. Lieutenant Klink's No. 1 section boat was the first to land, and he soon realised that the strong current had pushed them off course, putting them ashore right here on Fox Red sector, some 700 yards east of their intended landing point, and even worse, directly under the guns of WN-60. Moments later, Klink's LCA came under artillery fire. Some sources claim that it came from the field pieces above them, though their limited traverse and depression makes it unlikely. In fact, they were probably targeted by the 5cm anti-tank gun in a ring stand position just here at WN-61, about 780 yards to the west. Either way, a number of men were killed outright when the boat was struck, with the survivors clambering over the dead and wounded to get out as the craft wallowed in the surf, with 19 men lost in the chaos. The other 4 LCAs ground to a halt as they too hit the sand and dropped their ramps around here. Clusters of the famous mined log ramps and Czech hedgehogs stopped on Fox Green sector, so the only obstacles Company L encountered when they came ashore were some lines of Belgian gates and then a band of mine posts. But that lack of obstacles also meant a lack of cover, and soon the waterlogged attackers, weighed down with kit and ammunition, were trudging forwards across 200 yards of open sand under heavy machine gun fire, in hopes of reaching the shelter offered at the base of the cliff just under WN-60. Private John Sweeney, part of Lieutenant Monteith's second section, was there. All of a sudden, I got hit by machine gun fire coming from the left front. I was turned completely around, the bazooka I was carrying was full of holes, and the lifebelt I was wearing was taken right off me. A little further back, Staff Sergeant Vincent McKinney, a survivor of Klink's section, was the last to leave his sinking LCA. I didn't see a soul. I thought how eerie this was. I could see little puffs coming out of the sand where they were shooting at me. Despite the chaos and the hellish race along the beach, some men did reach the relative safety of the cliffs and were able to take cover from the fire of WN-60 above them and, to a lesser extent, that coming from WN-61. Amongst those assembled in this area, which included some 29th Division men who had become hopelessly lost, were Captain Armelino and Lieutenants Klink, Cutler and Monteith. A short time later, and well aware that staying put wasn't an option, Armelino spotted 2 distinctive deep-wading Sherman tanks which had successfully made it ashore onto Fox Red and began firing at targets of opportunity. Fortune was with Sergeant George Geddes a little further over in Easy Red, whose Sherman quickly managed to silence the potent 88 in WN-61, killing its commander, Oberfeldwebel Schnell, in the process. Within a few minutes, Sergeant Strozny of the 16th Company E managed to knock out a 5cm anti-tank gun just here in WN-61 with a bazooka, meaning that for now at least, the Shermans could operate around Fox sector with at least some degree of safety. But buttoned up as they were, with heavy small arms fire crisscrossing the area, they remained out of contact with the troops sheltering under the cliffs. The problem though was this: by 7:30, the mixed units under the cliffs were still completely pinned down, and with each passing minute the tide was rising. The result was that new troops, unsure of what was going on in the smoke-shrouded coastline to their front, were being disgorged onto beaches in front of unsuppressed machine guns, and after running the gauntlet to the cliffs, were finding it ever harder to shelter from enemy fire. Command and control was coming under severe strain too. The last arrivals on Fox, the men of Company K had lost their commander, Captain Prucknell, and XO to the same mortar round moments after landing, and with Companies I and M due to arrive in the next few minutes, Armelino knew that something had to be done. Bursting out of cover and sprinting across to establish contact with the 2 tanks in full view of the enemy, he was gravely wounded by a mortar shell fragment which struck his right thigh, severing an artery. Command on this part of the beach now fell to Lieutenant Cutler, with Monteith and Klink in support. After a quick discussion, it was decided that only one spot offered any hope of progress inland. It was right here, the entrance to the F1 draw. Accessed by a small break in the cliffs, but only 100 yards from the nearest guns of WN-60, it was a perilous prospect. Gathering his 2 30 caliber machine guns, he ordered his sections, 2nd, 3rd and 5th, to prepare to move. At the same time, and knowing their support was crucial, Jimmy Monteith set out in Captain Armelino's footsteps, racing across the open sand to the 2 Shermans. His luck held. Hammering on the turret of the lead tank for all he was worth, he managed to establish contact and pointed out the key targets in WN-60 which were covering the F1 draw. Moments later they began to move, taking up a position to add heavy covering fire against the strongpoint. Racing back to join his section, Monteith, Cutler, and the survivors on the beach began to climb. About that very same moment, offshore, Richard Taylor and the third wave were approaching Fox sector. His film footage starts in an LCA, where we can see the Royal Navy crew at the front, identified by the distinctive helmets, followed by numerous First ID troops, as well as shots of other LCAs and ships on the run-in. He even caught footage of an LCI-R firing rocket barrages at the coast. There's also a brief shot of the beach underneath the cliffs on Fox Red, where we can see troops scurrying about. Taylor's footage then switches to that very location. The time these shots were taken was likely between 8 and 9 o'clock, since the tide, which reached its height at 10:12 that day, had already reached the second band of obstacles but hadn't fully consumed the beach yet. The final shot of this part of the film shows assaulting troops trudging towards the cliff. Moments later, these two men will be cut down by machine gun fire. Taylor was also wounded in the arm before these shots were taken. In fact, this scene of a man holding his hand with a bandage is believed to be Taylor, and these shots were actually taken by his commander, Lieutenant Martin Grossfeld, using Taylor's camera. The next roll was taken hours later, likely around 10:30 am, as you can see the tide has significantly moved in. In the background, and to the east of WN60, we see what looks like a beached LCT, which is still in view in this shot, showing medics carrying a wounded comrade, presumably to escape from the rising tide. This section of film is also accompanied by a series of famous photos, some that were taken from negatives of Taylor's film. Bandaged men huddle along the protective cliff, various units of the 3rd Battalion and some stragglers of Company E of the 29th Division. One of the photos, taken some time later, probably around 11:20 am, featuring troops disembarking from an LCI, actually shows the back of the 2 Sherman tanks with their wading snorkels clearly identifiable that had been directed by Lieutenant Monteith. Sergeant Taylor's iconic film is the only surviving footage that was taken on the beach during the assault waves, ironically taken on a lesser-known sector of bloody Omaha. Let's return and examine the detail of this powerful aerial shot to consider the situation at that crucial time. As we know, high tide was at precisely 10:12 am that morning, which leaves us 2 options with regard to this image. 1, it's taken just before high tide, or 2, it's taken just after, so about 9:30 am or about 10:45. But we do have a few clues. The real telltale that this is actually after high tide is right here. A landing craft hard up against the cliffs. This could only have happened if it lodged there at the height of flood. So considering that, and the waterline in the aerial, we can be pretty sure that this shot is taken sometime between 10:30 and 11:30 am. But there's more detail to explore here. First, we see several landing craft just offshore, but based on the contents of the interior, clearly flooded, perhaps indicating they are swamped craft from the earlier waves. But secondly, there are several groups of men sheltering close to the cliffs. This perspective makes it likely that they are, at the very least, on a beach still under fire, or are themselves casualties. In fact, by highlighting the profile of the cliffs in that area, very different from today due to erosion, and comparing them with Taylor's stills and footage from the beach, we see a very similar form. So obviously we can't be certain, but it's not out of the question that Richard Taylor is one of these dots down here in this location at that very moment, capturing perhaps the most iconic footage of D-Day. The second aerial opens up a question about what actually happened on the ground. What we do see here are likely the very same Sherman tanks that Monteith had contacted, and we can also clearly identify the F1 draw entrance. But there are 2 possible routes to take from that point. 1, directly up the Fisherman's Track, outflanking WN60, or 2, taking the German-built route directly to the strong point itself. Surviving records suggest that the advance made by the men on the ground actually took the Fisherman's Track, skirting the base of the WN before attacking from the flank and rear. Though we should also consider that there were by this time several other groups off the beach in this same area, including one led by Company K's Captain Richmond, who, like their comrades in Company L, had already endured a chaotic and costly morning. Whatever the actual route, there's little doubt that the additional firepower offered by the tanks in close support, along with more heavy weapons in the hands of the newly arrived M Company, brought sufficient space for the hard-pressed men of the 16th to advance up the F1 draw. But let's dispel another myth here. There was no headlong charge into the German lines. Rather, it was an extremely slow, frightening, mentally and physically exhausting advance, with the men moving in rough diamond formation from cover to cover below the ever-watchful Germans. Monteith, in the lead, stopped and studied the area every chance he could, and at one point ran back to the beach to further direct the two tanks onto the stubborn defences. It's often cited that Lieutenant Monteith had tanks literally follow him up the F1 draw, but if you know the actual layout, this was impossible. It was simply too steep and the ground too loose for 30-ton tanks. As we see in this photo, he probably directed them right up onto the shingle as close as they could get to the small cliff, and then to fire 75mm rounds directly at WN-60. From this spot, they were able to knock out the two 75mm guns in the dugout positions that had been lobbing shells further along the packed beach all morning. Yard by yard, and under constant harassing fire, the advance continued, with small groups arriving and departing the general movement inland. By mid-morning, after a nerve-wracking and grueling climb, the summit of the bluffs was in sight. This low-level reconnaissance shot, taken on the 19th of May 1944, of the exact area we're discussing, offers a fascinating perspective. The German-built track leading to WN-60 is clearly visible, as is the line of the Fisherman's Path. Crucially, the route appears to lie in defilade from the guns of WN-60, supporting the suggestion that the advance followed this valley and outflanked the strong point to the west. It was during this movement that a patrol led by PFC Joseph Likovich found itself in a grenade-tossing duel with some of the German defenders in WN-60's western trench. Lieutenant Klenk, seeing the danger, ordered some of his men to fix bayonets and clear it out. As they moved in, 15 defenders of Company 3, exhausted and outnumbered, had had enough and surrendered. Around the same time, the survivors of L Company under Lieutenant Cutler forced their own way towards the summit of the bluffs in a brutal yard-by-yard advance, with 17-year-old Private Joe Argencio reportedly silencing a German machine gun with a well-placed grenade at just a few yards range. This is the point where I usually like to say, and finally WN-60 was captured and draw F1 was open. But it doesn't work like that, and it didn't then either. The truth is the fight was a drawn-out and confusing affair, more akin to a series of individual skirmishes than a coherent battle, and establishing timings are tricky to say the least. That said, it was clear by late morning that the tide had literally and metaphorically turned, as the leading men of the 16th passed well beyond WN-60 and on towards the hamlets of Cabot and Le Grand Amour. Testament to the importance of WN-60 came a short time later in the form of determined German counterattacks to drive the Americans back into the sea and reclaim their lost stretch of the Atlantic Wall. But to no avail. The same determination the GIs had shown in climbing the bluffs that morning kept them there that afternoon, but not without cost. In the thick of that final fight, as he had been all day, was Jimmy Monteith. This powerful citation recalls what happened next. Supervising the defence of his newly won position against repeated vicious counterattacks, he continued to ignore his own personal safety, repeatedly crossing the 200 or 300 yards of open terrain under heavy fire to strengthen links in his defensive chain. When the enemy succeeded in completely surrounding 1st Lieutenant Monteith and his unit while leading the fight out of the situation, he was killed by enemy fire. His courage, gallantry, and intrepid leadership is worthy of emulation. It was actions just like that, performed by men known and unknown, which ultimately meant that when night fell on the eastern end of Omaha Beach, at the end of the longest day, WN-60 and this small patch of ground remained in Allied hands. Today, Jimmy Monteith, whose mother was presented with the Medal of Honor on behalf of her late son, and 9,387 other US personnel, many of whom lost their lives on D-Day, lie buried here, in the immaculately kept Normandy American Cemetery, just a stone's throw from WN-60 and overlooking Omaha Beach. Not many miles away, and worthy I think of our consideration here, is another cemetery in which 21,000 German servicemen lie buried, including Alfred Eberhard, who commanded WN-60 that day and who, along with thousands of others from all sides, fell in the brutal combat in the weeks to come.